Okay, so now that we got everything kind of taken apart, cleaned and inspected, we're going to go ahead and put this air side back together, and then we'll go through adjusting the center line and the valving rod and the PCD and retainer. Okay, so we want to make sure that the recessed bore, not the flat, is out, because it will retain the spring and spool. So when we drop that in, make sure it doesn't flip over on us. Tap that to the bottom. Okay, so now we can take some fusion lube on these O-rings. So the notch side will go into the handle bore, so we need to put the spool in. The set screw for pushing against the trigger, it goes out. So we first want to put that spool in. Then we can put the spool liner and spool and spring. As an assembly into the gun. I like to take a 3/8 deep well socket and just make sure that spool liner is all the way down. Make sure the spring return is working well, then we can go ahead and put the retainer on. We'll lube in the threads, that way if it crosses over, we'll get it apart again. Passageway screws back into the back end of the gun. Small one goes first. Slide that up. Then the larger one. Okay, so now we can return our trigger, the shoulder bolt, and elastic stop nut. Bring that just snug so it won't pinch the valve. Okay, so the spool is back into the handle. Now we can attach the cylinder to the handle portion of the gun. We just want to put some grease on the 3 O-rings. The 2 here and the 1 there. What I like to do is get the handle cylinder front screws in. We're not going to tighten these all the way until we get that rear cylinder clamp and screw lined up. Just going to bottom them out. At this point we can put our piston back together. So grease in the grooves. This one has a step. So now we're just going to move up these O-rings really good, a little in the cylinder. When we're looking at this piston, one side's flat, one side has the machine bore. This is the side that goes out because it will retain the spring. So we want to make sure when we put it in, we get the orientation of that right. So now we can add our spring, replace the O-ring on the rear cap. We'll go ahead and tighten that cap up. Okay, so at this point we're going to put the clamp and screw. Remember, the flat goes against here. The chamfered edge is going to catch the cylinder rear cap lip here. Gonna hold it in place, get that started. Before I totally snug it down, I just like to make sure it's sitting in the recess quite nicely. We can just snug that up. Okay, now we have to remember we got to go back and fully tighten these front screws in. Snug them down. Okay, so that's the air cylinder back together. Before we go ahead and put the center line and the gun block back on, we want to back off the front cylinder stop. So we need to loosen the cylinder stop nut. This holds this in place. If we don't loosen that up, we're going to tear up the threads on this brass front cylinder stop. So now what we want to do is we want to turn it clockwise and facing the front of the gun. That's actually pulling the cylinder stop back. That's going to position this valving rod so we're not going to hit the PCD and damage into the valving rod, and then we'll adjust that up to the tip once we get it started. So at this point we can just set this aside and we can get our gun block back together, then we'll put our valving rod in and make that adjustment. So again, remember we have an A side and a resin side. The notch indicates the ISO, so we'll just go ahead and start with the resin. We have the screen screw, it's clean. We got the check valve seal assembly and the screen screw seal. Okay, so we're going to put a little bit of fusion lube on the threads, thread that back into our gun block. We'll fully snug that up once we get the gun block back onto the handle. Screw back on. Check valve assembly and seal. Thread that in. Now we can put our rear seal and retainer back in. Snug that up. We're just going to put the adjustment on loosely because we have to get the valving rod in there. We want to make sure this port is clean to the air clean off and the port that corresponds. Light coating of grease. Carefully get that lined up to the handle. Gonna snug that down. When we go and get everything back together again, we'll loosen that up, trigger a few times, and they kind of call that centering the center line components of this gun. Okay, so with that, we need to return our air supply, but before I do so, I want to make sure that I get the clean off air valve back into the side of the cylinder. Just leave that off. That'll be our final adjustment. So again, we're going to want air, and we want to trigger that cylinder so we can put the valve rod without putting extra pressure on these threads when we go to assemble. We're just going to trigger the gun. A little bit of lube on the valving rod. A lot of the guns, the original design, this valving rod was two pieces. They had the drawbar and the rod. If they're still in good shape and continue to use them, you replace them, they'll come as this one-piece valving rod. That's started. Trigger the gun. I'm just going to bring that tight. Okay, so at that point, we can put our safety stack back on, but we're going to leave it in the open position because we're going to need to trigger the gun to get our module back on. We need to get the front seal into the seal retainer. Kind of has a bit of an interference fit. It should fit in there. I'm going to go ahead and get these other components ready. So we have the module. Before we return the module, we just want to make sure that all the ports are clean. This one actually has 4 ports on the ISO and 4 ports on the resin. It's good and clean, okay. And we can trigger the gun. The module in place. The front seal and retainer. Okay, so you can see the valving rod's actually farther back. We'll have to go ahead and make that adjustment with the front cylinder stop. We want the air on while we make this adjustment so that we know that that piston is all the way forward. So again, make sure the top stop is loose. And then we're just going to place the PCD on, turning it counterclockwise from the front view. This is actually moving the rod. We'll actually kind of feel that PCD spin when the rod makes contact. Okay, so we're actually there. Back it off about a half a turn. So I went just a skosh far. If we got it just to make the contact, then we'd go about a quarter of a turn. We're just going to go ahead and trigger that gun. Make sure that that rod's not touching the front retainer. So go ahead and trigger and hold. Now we can put the PCD retainer. I'll snug that up. Okay, at this point what I want to do is make sure that I tighten my top nut. Just kind of snug that up to hold that front piston stop in place. Remember I said we wanted to go back, and so we're going to loosen that screw, kind of just bring it tight, trigger a few times. Make sure it's snug, and then at this point we could go ahead and tighten our rear packing nut as well. So snug that up. Good. We can return our stop on and remove our air supply. And remember, we want to go back and snug the screen screw cap now that I can get a little leverage with the gun. Be overly tight, but we don't want them to leak. And the last thing to go on are the manifold gaskets and the air cap. Drilled on there. We don't need to get pliers overly aggressive. Get these started. It takes a little tap to seat them. So they don't come off. Then if we're going to store the gun, I'm just going to fill those ports up with grease. Otherwise, we can grease the front of the gun, adjust our clean off air. So you just about a turn or so, and then we'll be ready to spray. Return it to the gun manifold, and it's going to be ready to go.